Retro Future.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am Bansert of Radio Retro Future, and today I want to talk about the difference between settings and genre. Now, in my last video I explained why there have been so few updates on the channel. Excuse me if it is a bit rambly, but essentially I'm working on a book, The Association of Ishtar, and it is basically the promotion of my take on the steampunk genre. And why I want to talk about genre and settings in particular is because I've seen statements that there's no such thing as the steampunk genre and that steampunk is purely a setting. I do not agree with this. Anyone who is familiar with my Steampunk Beginner's Guide knows I have dedicated entire videos on steampunk as a genre. So let's start with what do I think a genre is and what do I think a setting is. Now, first, let's talk about the word steampunk, and I feel this is a mantra of mine at this point. So if you watch more of you heard me say this before, but for me, steampunk can mean either one of three things. Either you're talking about the steampunk genre, aka the stories, we'll talk more about that later, the aesthetics, we'll talk a little bit about that with settings, and of course the third one, which is the community. They're related, but they're absolutely not the same thing. And so when you talk about, I advise this to anyone, when you talk about steampunk, whenever you use the word steampunk, well, please explain what you mean with that. Like, why is something not steampunk? Well, you start first off with what you think steampunk is, and there's far too little talk on this, and it really frustrates me. But genre, what do I understand to be the steampunk genre? Now, first of all, why I call steampunk a genre is because I feel it is something unique. Like, it doesn't mean that it's has a monopoly on anything, but I do believe that the steampunk genre is unique enough to call it a genre of its own. That I want to clarify right off the bat. And that being that we know science fiction, we know alternate history, and for me, steampunk is a combination of both of those. William Gibson described it as cyberpunk in the past because it was originally created by cyberpunk authors like Gibson himself. So it's very logical that they took many of the themes, which is, the exploration between humans and their technological environment. There's also like a lot of themes surrounding, control and capitalism and those type of, and corporatism rather, actually. And so they took that into the past, in an alternate history in which modern technology, for example, the computer, in case of the Victorian era, the Difference Engine by Babbage, is the first steampunk novel, and it was particularly written to be a combination of science fiction, aka cyberpunk, with alternate history, and see how that change in technology changed our timeline. That's why International Steampunk Day is on the day that the Difference Engine was presented in the Royal Society. The more you know, is on that day. This is not an uncommon theme in alternative history, but if there is an actual difference between the two, it's really that emphasis on science fiction, sci-fi technology, or Clarke Tech in most cases. I did an episode on it already, a matter of fact, so I'll put a link in the description. So yeah, but what does that mean? Okay, so we have cyberpunk in the past. What does that mean? Well, it is, for me, I use that definition as a framework, or rather a toolbox. So I know that when I write something and I want something to be like steampunk, I know on what to focus, what the general course of action I should take. So it's a tool. Genre is not so much, well, a setting, as some people call it. That's a problem. I think the problem is that people don't know what a genre is, which is a collection of stories with similar themes and tropes mostly tropes. So, what's a setting then? Well, a setting is more related to the world building. It's more related to the environment in which the characters move. When you have, for example, the archetypical fantasy story of Lord of the Rings, we have fantastical creatures, we have a fantastical world, we have all these, well, not so much magical kingdoms, but we do have wizards, so we have like the presence of magic, not so much supernatural, but magic, which is a substance that can be manipulated and controlled by humans. And there is this whole mythological element, in these stories, like a warrior can take out 100 orcs, like in Conan, this guy that is this behemoth of a man that cannot be taken on, or he's fighting wizards and demigods and other monsters. Now, you cannot have such characters in, let's say, I mentioned, the English cop dramas like Inspector Moore or Touch of Frost. You can't make those inspectors to be these invincible behemoths. You just can't. Not only does it thematically not make sense, because they're supposed to be normal humans who use their intellect to find out who the murderer is. So there is also, in the setting, is also appeals to a particular audience. Like, you can have fantasy where all the characters are, well, very human, very vulnerable. They cannot take on dragons and monsters. However, some people really like the power fantasy of like a Conan-esque warrior who can take on a legion of orcs. These are choices that are made in the settings, but they're both, despite these two extremes, they're still fantasy because they have those themes in common. Like, they both still have monsters, they both still have magic, they both have the fantastical world with floating islands and cities under the sea. And we accept that because, well, it's fantasy. We accept these things exist. The power levels of the character are, well, different, are like chocolate and vanilla, really. But they're still ice cream. But when you transfer such elements to, for like example, science fiction. Now, there are science fictions, of course, where you have like very powerful characters. However, the power levels are significantly lower. Because we want our science fiction characters to be smarter. We want our science fiction characters to be more scientific, more explorers. And this is why a lot of people don't like, for example, the new Star Wars, because the old Star Wars, like the Jedi, they had mystical powers, but like they had issues lifting like objects like planes out of the swamp, for example. That took a lot of effort, and here they're like waving around entire spaceships like they're nothing. And that's a disconnect between what the classic fans want, and maybe the new fans do want like this ultra powerful Jedi, but considering the movies were not that successful, no. However, if you would have done that with a purely fantastical setting, you might have gotten away with that more, because having a setting is also kind of like your connection you as a writer have with your audience. Like, what kind of characters does my audience want to see when I'm writing my science fiction or my fantasy? If you write a typical police procedural, you will not have them like be these Arnold Schwarzenegger type characters who solve all their problems with machine guns. I mean, you can do it as a kind of like Hot Fuzz did brilliantly. But that movie really understood the differences between the English police procedurals and like the Michael Bay action flicks with cops. And they kind of like bashed those two together in this just. It's sort of still some of my favorite movies, but they showed a very uh, good understanding of what made both of them work. They understood the camera tropes, the way the cameras were moving, the way the cameras were shot, the way that objects were shot. They applied all those tropes and juxtaposed them masterfully. So you had like this really weird but very relatable series where they like had this chase scene like in an action movie, but it was shot very much like a English police procedural, which gave this really awesome juxtaposition. That is but that is both understanding the setting, which is a toolbox for how you build your relationship with your audience, how you frame things, how you build your world, how the world interacts with the characters and vice versa. Where genre is really your general framework. Okay, this is going to be like the themes I want to explore in case of steampunk, the relationship between man and machine in their particular historical period. In fantasy, it's going to be mostly a typical hero's journey where the character like is on a quest for revenge, for instance. Not to say that these themes cannot be switched around. I will talk about that. However, when you say, well, I'm writing a fantasy novel, people will most likely expect a hero's journey. So when you do not do that, you need to communicate it on your back flap like, oh yeah, it's a fantasy world, but it's also a detective noir. See? And the other saying, well, it's going to be a steampunk adventure. However, it's going to have dragons. Because those two particular sets don't usually go together. So knowing what your genre is and what your setting is, which is, basically you're kind of like arranging a dinner like okay, it's gonna be a fancy dinner and the menu is gonna be French, something like that. I think that's a good comparison. But it's something that they all have their own approaches. Like you need your fancy dinner with your particular table. When you say, well, it's going to be fancy dinner, you cannot come up with a medieval banquet table, for instance. And when you say we're going to eat French, you cannot come up with an American hamburger with I don't believe you call them French fries anymore, but you get my drift, right? You need to be clear on what your genre is, your framework, what tools you're going to use, the setting, and no, I meant to say, the framework, the tools you're going to use, and the themes. Yes, that was the word I was looking for, themes. While the setting is really like, it's both aesthetics, it's a mixture of aesthetics, the relationship between the character and the world itself. So the setting is really the finer details. Now, that being said, like I talked about steampunk very heavily as alternative history. That being said, can the toolbox of the steampunk genre be applied to a fantasy setting? And this is why I make this difference. The answer is, well, yes. However, with a big, big asterisk. Because just because you're using similar tools to, let's say, steampunk, doesn't mean that these are unique. Like, what makes steampunk unique for me is that combination of alternate history and science fiction and pop culture tropes. A lot of pop culture tropes. That is what makes it unique. Like, but it is a melange of pre-existing genres like science fiction, cyberpunk. I keep repeating myself. But to use the themes in particular of cyberpunk, and that being again that relationship between man and machine and the world. Um, it is done in fantasy. It's not done often, but there are a few rare examples. That being, for example, Arcanum. Arcanum is like a fantasy world that has a very strong steampunk elements, but I guess you can also call them cyberpunk elements. So, but because of the combination of the obvious historical references, I think that is what makes it stand out from cyberpunk in that regard. It's the obvious historical references to the world of Arcanum is a fantasy world with all the known races. However, it's going through the Industrial Revolution, so it has steam engines. And because One Nation has like all these steam-powered weapons and weaponry, the old world, which was consistent out of mages and dragon knights and that type of fantasy tropes, yeah, they're getting overwhelmed by this nation that has like, you know, all these industrialized weapons and firearms, and so the old world is being devoured by the new. And that is where the steampunk elements really come in. Like, it really goes into, like, the dwarves are suffering because no one really needed them anymore. They were the original creators of the steam engine, then some human started making steam engines, and they didn't need the dwarves anymore. So the dwarves were basically forgotten because why go to these arrogant, snooty dwarves if we can make their technology ourselves? You got like a nation of dragon knights, I think they were, and they were also defeated by this army of peasants armed with firearms, so they were wiped off the map. So you see this element of magic versus, you know, mythological dragons versus technology return in a lot of places of that world. Also, the mages are not welcome anymore because you know, technology uses the laws of physics and magic is, you know, anything but the laws of physics. They're not allowed to go anywhere near the steam engines. So when you are, for example, boarding the train, the mage needs to go at the back of the train. Which, of course, brings, you know, the two black people at the back of the bus type of reference. But then this is different because, you know, accidents might happen. But still, it feels discriminatory. So that's, again, what I mean. These are the themes that are very typical of, you know, the type of steampunk that I write and I try to promote on my channel. So what about... you know, the steampunk-esque books that do not use alternate history. Well, this is where the setting comes into play, because when you want to write a fantasy adventure with the steampunk aesthetic, you can totally do that. There's nothing that stops you from doing that other than, you know, I don't know. But if you want to appeal to, let's say, the Gibsonian steampunks like myself, you know, well, I have this steampunk world and it has like dragons and talking ponies. You know, I'm not interested. It just does not interest me. Now, if you would change the to a more steampunk-like framework with like Arcanum has, that's okay. Well, that interests me. I like those themes. But for example, the Dwemer, are they steampunk? They are an extinct, or almost extinct, I should say, species of dwarven-like beings in the Elder Scrolls series. And they left behind all these ruins with all these robots. Now, aesthetically, it is pretty obvious where they got their inspiration from. But then again, with an asterisk that steampunk does not have a monopoly on the aesthetics that steampunk uses. The aesthetics of steampunk are very much inspired by old classic science fiction. That's why I often refer to the steampunk community as the antiquarians of pop culture, because they make references to old pop culture, like, for example, Metropolis. You know, Giger is getting in there. Because, you know, that's also starting to become old. Of course, Aliens is still popular in that regard, or used to be. Latest movies were not so successful, but those things are can be seen, are preserved in the steampunk aesthetic. Um, and I kind of forgot where I was going with that. But as to the steampunk setting world, yeah, the monopoly of steampunk on aesthetic. Steampunk does not have an aesthetic. So steampunk does have an aesthetic, but not a monopoly on that aesthetic. That's what I wanted to say. And the Dwemer, like, yeah, they probably have a lot of heavy steampunk influences in there, like the emphasis on steam engines, the emphasis on giant cogs. So yeah, there might be steampunk influence in there, but it's very tailored to that magical fantasy setting. Like they have magical crystals, they have soul gems, so it's very tailored to the Elder Scrolls setting, and that is a fantasy setting. So yeah, I have no issue saying, well, there are clear steampunk influences there, but is it steampunk? No, superficially, if you talk aesthetics, that is. But it's really a fantastical civilization. And by the way, that's not a value judgment, that's an observation. Let that be clear. And if steampunks are influenced by that, that's fine. That's not the problem. That's not the issue that I'm talking about. But understand, or at least I think it's important to make a separation between what you're trying to create and where your influences come from. Like I said, steampunk uses a lot of pop culture tropes. Like, take for example the steampunk variation on Disney characters. I mean, just because someone made a steampunk version of a Disney character doesn't make that Disney character all of a sudden steampunk. No, the artist has taken the elements of steampunk and applied them to a Disney character because they think that looks cool. And they do. They're wonderful drawings. But that's separating what you call steampunk and where you draw your inspirations from. This is also why I made videos on, for example, the arts and crafts movement and Art Deco, because steampunk has incorporated a lot of those elements into its aesthetics. Many people are not aware of this, which is a shame, because instead of looking outside for inspiration, like, okay, I wanna have a building that looks like impressive, that's like, you know, this symbolic building that just dominates the landscape. What was a style dedicated to just doing that? That is Art Deco. So, unknowingly, probably, or maybe intentionally, I feel a lot of this is accidental. Steampunk artists started looking for buildings that do that. They find Art Deco buildings, they like the style, they copy it, and it does have the effect, but they are not aware that Art Deco is meant to achieve that. And knowing such things, knowing where your inspiration comes from, understanding your source of inspiration really helps you elaborate on your setting and elevating the themes from a genre perspective. It helps you accentuate some of the themes you're trying to apply. I think I talked a lot. I think I talked enough about the subject. I hope it wasn't too rambly. Let me know if you want me to talk about similar topics in the future. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And please, please, please share this on your social networks, because YouTube will not. So, I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, make things your way. Goodbye.